On September 15th of this year, a referendum will be held in the northern section of Iraq, known as Iraqi Kurdistan, to potentially determine the future territorial status of their nation. For those who don't keep up with current events and global politics, that probably doesn't mean much, but the ethnic Kurds that inhabit the region and surrounding areas, as well as the Kurdish diaspora around the globe, are currently awaiting the results with trepidation but excitement, seeing how this could bring massive changes to the region of the Middle East and set a precedent for future secessionist movements. The exact wording of the referendum is as such: do you want the Kurdistan region and the Kurdistani areas outside the region's administration to become an independent state? The Kurdish people are an ethnic group lying in the heart of the Middle East, being currently divided between the countries of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and the group has had a long history of war, disputes, and friction with the surrounding nations. They're an Iranian ethnic group, meaning that they speak an Indo-Iranian language like the Persians to their east, with the Kurdish language being divided into four main dialects: Kermanji, or Northern Kurdish, Sorani, or Central Kurdish, Gorani, and Zaza, which are divergent enough from Standard Kurdish to be considered separate languages. The Kurds as an ethnic group have inhabited their core region for well over 2,000 years, being descended from ancient Persian-speaking peoples since before the Achaemenid Empire's rise to power. In the past 100 years, the Kurds had been under the banner of only two regional powers, the Ottoman Empire and Persia, but following the fall and partition of the Ottomans, the Kurds find themselves divided, although Kurdish nationalism is still growing. One thing must be made clear though: this is a referendum, not an amendment, meaning the results of said election will not necessarily be enacted into law by the Iraqi government, at least not immediately, in the same way that the Brexit referendum for the United Kingdom was voted on in mid-2016, yet is still in the final stages of bureaucracy and negotiations over a year after it was passed. Although in reality it'd be more comparable to if the US state of Texas decided to hold an independence referendum one day, and although the government of Texas might uphold the results, the United States government is not required to, and in all actuality, never would recognize the ramifications of said referendum, or even acknowledge that it happened. As with all unrepresented people groups on the planet, the fate of the Kurds lies not with the people themselves, but with the governments that preside over them. A similar referendum was held in the same region of northern Iraq 12 years ago, also calling for Kurdish independence, receiving nearly 2 million votes, with 99% of them being in favor of leaving, and nothing happened. So what's different this time? The one major change to the region since 2005 would of course be the rise of ISIS, or Daesh, and the accompanying chaos and civil wars that have engulfed nearly all of the Levant in the past decade. This conflict has greatly weakened the federal government and military of the countries of Iraq and Syria, both of which contain chunks of the Kurdish homeland, and conversely, the de facto governments of both Iraqi and Syrian Kurdistan are now considerably far more stable and secure than their respective countries. Because each section of Kurdistan lies in a different country, they all have various diverging histories and cultures, with the area currently being administered as Iraqi Kurdistan being the second largest at around 7 million, with an area of around 80,000 square kilometers, making it about the same size as the country of the Czech Republic or the United Arab Emirates. The area lies exclusively in the northeast of Iraq, and although it is not the largest in either area or population of the Kurdish regions, Iraqi Kurdistan is currently the spearhead in tackling the issue of Kurdish independence, seeing how the region is the most autonomous ever since the near collapse of the Iraqi federal government. Syrian Kurdistan, also known as Rojava, is less established and smaller than the Iraqi portion at around 3 million people, although recent estimates on this vary considerably, seeing how many non-ethnic Kurds from ISIS-occupied Syria had fled to the region, seeing how it was more heavily defended and stable, and Rojava has also become far more autonomous in recent years. Iranian Kurdistan to the east has around 8 million people, and although many maps of Kurdistan might also include segments of Iran stretching all the way down south to the Gulf, it's important to realize that these maps are actually including a separate ethnic group known as the Lur people, another Iranian ethnic group related to the Kurds but have a rather separate identity. Turkish Kurdistan is the largest in both area and population at around 18 million people, with it being incredibly difficult to pinpoint just exactly where the Kurds live, and how many there are in Turkey, saying how Turkey has a strict policy regarding the teaching of the Kurdish language in public schools and encourages Kurds to learn Turkish instead. The likelihood of any of these regions becoming independent anytime soon is admittedly very unlikely, with the government of Turkey being especially disdainful of Kurdish separatism, and the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, has been engaged in an active guerrilla warfare against the Turkish government since the 1980s, controversially targeting not only government officials but civilians in places like Ankara and Istanbul as well. If Iraqi Kurdistan in itself were to become independent, which again is unlikely, it would border the countries of Syria to the west, Turkey to the north, Iran to the east, and the remainder of Iraq to the south. Although if the greater Kurdistan region were to be united, then it might also border the countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan through the enclave of Nakhchivan as well. Varying countries have expressed a wide range of opinions on the upcoming referendum, with countries like Turkey and Iran denouncing it, no doubt partially fueled by fears that said referendum could inspire similar demands by their own ethnic Kurdish population, while other countries such as Israel and Poland have expressed full support for an independent Kurdistan, and other major influences in the region such as the United States and Russia have remained largely neutral. If Kurdistan as a whole were to become an independent country in the next few years, here's what it would look like. With a population of around 30 to 35 million people, Kurdistan becomes a mid-sized country, being around the same size that Iraq is today. The population is mostly Muslim, with major minorities of Christians, with around 1.2 million Assyrians, 200,000 Armenians, and about 90,000 ethnic Kurdish Christians. Iraqi Kurdistan has expressed a strong interest in recent years in protecting Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities, so it's possible that the new nation of Kurdistan will absorb most, if not all, of the Christians of Iraq and Syria. Perhaps major ethnic minority groups like the Assyrians and Yazidis could be granted their own territory in the new state akin to an autonomous region, which Iraqi Kurdistan has already expressed an interest in doing. The religious situation in Kurdistan is a bit confusing, saying how just who is considered Muslim and who isn't is a bit fuzzy at times. Certain ethno-religious groups such as the Yarsani and Shabaki, who are considered ethnically Kurdish, adhere to a faith that has influences from pre-Islamic Gnostic religions such as Zoroastrianism, and it's still argued in the Islamic world whether Gnostic groups like these are actually Muslims or whether they practice a different religion altogether, which effectively makes them the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses of the Islamic world. The Yazidis, on the other hand, are most certainly not an Islamic group, and because of this, they've been one of the groups most heavily targeted by the wrath of ISIS, with Yazidis fleeing abroad and to neighboring Armenia, which has a small, well-established Yazidi community. There have been millions of interethnic marriages recently between Kurds with Arabs, Persians, and especially Turks in southeast Turkey, which has been heavily encouraged by the government, which hopes that this will expedite the process of Turkification, wherein the descendants of such marriages will identify solely as Turkish and speak only the Turkish language, leaving behind their Kurdish culture and heritage. Historically, almost all the countries with major Kurdish minorities have always seen the ethnic group as a threat, and Kurds have faced discrimination, whether from the general public or the actual federal government, in the case of Ba'athist Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was notoriously brutal towards the Kurdish civilians in the north, with many calling his acts of violence an act of ethnic cleansing. Large numbers of Kurdish people live in many parts of their home countries that are not a part of the traditional Kurdish homeland. For instance, there's an enclave of ethnic Kurds located in the Khorasan region of Iran near the border of Turkmenistan that were supplanted there by the Safavid Empire 400 years ago to act as a buffer between the Persian homeland and aggressive Central Asian tribes. In Turkey, there's huge numbers of Kurds in central Anatolia, west of their most concentrated region, as well as there being a huge Kurdish community in the city of Istanbul. There was previously a community of Kurds in the former Soviet Union in between Armenia and the autonomous territory of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, but our good buddy Stalin basically gave that community the middle finger and sent them all to Central Asia and Siberia. Additionally, around 1.3 million Kurds live in Europe, mostly Turkish Kurds in Germany, and 100,000 live in North America, mostly in the states of Tennessee and Texas. Why those states? I don't know. Judging by recent and historical events, The territory of Iraqi Kurdistan is probably the most likely of all the Kurdish regions to gain independence, seeing how the central Iraqi government has had to allocate huge segments of their manpower and resources in fighting ISIS, and they'll probably sacrifice a large chunk of time and troops in the future suppressing any rising insurgencies. Again, the upcoming referendum is non-binding, and therefore there's no indication that the Iraqi government will uphold the results or even acknowledge that the referendum even existed. The next would probably be Syrian Kurdistan for much of the same reasons, as the Syrian government is possibly in an even worse position than Iraq. Now, as for the territories of Kurdistan lying in Iran and Turkey, they will most likely never be independent from their home countries, short of a violent revolution, seeing how uncompromising the two are on the issue of Kurdish sovereignty and autonomy. Although we will most likely never see an independent Kurdistan in our lifetime, it's important to realize that the Kurdish people do exist. They do have their own culture and language, and they aren't going away anytime soon. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on a potential independent Kurdistan, as well as the Kurdish, Zaza, Gorani, Yazidi, and Shabaki people. As always, thank you for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.